The rare manuscript that I will introduce to you contains a Hebrew treatise composed by Jewish author Abraham ben Mordecai Farissol. Farissol was born in Avignon, Provence, in 1452, but spent most of his life in northern Italy. He was attracted by the thriving intellectual atmosphere of the peninsula in the 15th century. He wandered about Mantua, Florence, and Ferrara, where he mainly lived and where he died after 1528. The treatise is titled Iggeret Orhot Olam, or Letter on the Paths of the World. In it, the author aims to describe the most important geographic discoveries of his days in a Judaic context. This work contains the first mention of the discovery of the New World and the first description of it in Hebrew literature. This treatise has the earliest known sketch of America in a Hebrew book. This is why this work and this particular manuscript plays such a significant role for American, no less than Italian history, in addition to telling us a great deal about the place of the Jewish scientist and intellectual in the Renaissance. I wish to stress that the Hebrew word Iggeret means both letter and treatise, and was a common term used for the titles of medieval Hebrew scientific and doctrinal literature. However, in this case, the word could also have been inspired by the contemporary literary genre of the letters sent by the explorers of the New World. Farissol's book was written in Ferrara and completed on the first day Rosh Chodesh, the new moon of the Jewish month of Kislev, of the year 285 according to the Jewish dating system that corresponds to the end of the year 1524. When Farissol wrote his treatise, the Jewish population of Ferrara numbered around 2,000 souls, a large number relative to the total population of the city, which was around 30,000 people. The Jewish population of Ferrara had grown dramatically at the turn of the 16th century, reflecting the massive expulsions of Jews from Spain and Portugal, and the various waves of migration of thousands of exiles from southern Italy, when the Kingdom of Naples was absorbed into the Spanish territories. Italian Duke Ercole or Hercules I and his wife Eleonora welcomed Jewish exiles in their dukedom. In Hercules' lands, Jews were accepted in all trades, were allowed to farm taxes, and could own properties. The Duke extended to them a papal permission to practice medicine among Christians. Such excellent conditions for Ferrara's Jews continued with Hercules' descendants and attracted new waves of exiles to the city all throughout the Cinquecento. Among them were also crypto-Jews or conversos from Portugal, Jews forced to convert to Catholicism, who often reverted to Judaism after their arrival in Italy. Besides the traditional activities of loan banking, usually run by Italian or Ashkenazi Jewish families, new industries, especially in silk weaving, were established by the Sephardi newcomers, who traded with the Iberian Peninsula and the Spanish colonies in the east. Jews likewise stimulated the export trade by their transactions with conversos in Flanders and France, in Rome and Venice. This is why, for all of them, trading routes were very significant, and we understand why Farissol's treatise Orhot Olam highlights the relevance of the new commercial routes opened by Portuguese and Spanish explorers of the oceans. Abraham Farissol lived in a very special environment, at a period when the Jewish component of Farraran society would have been visible to everybody and everywhere. Jews were present at court, in the streets, and in the markets. There were Jewish artists, especially goldsmiths, like Meir da Sessa and his wife, who worked for the Duke and for his family. We know of at least 2 portraits by the scarcely studied but excellent Venetian painter Bartolomeo Veneto that can be associated with Jewish Northern Italian society. One of the 2 portraits presently belongs to a private collection in Milan. It depicts a lovely young lady in the garb of Jael, the biblical heroine who killed Israel's enemy Sisera by driving a nail into his head. Hammer and nail are clearly visible in the lady's hands. However, if we zoom into the image, we observe a very significant detail. Under Jael's delicate fingers, a precious ring appears, a jewel that matches the standards of early 16th century Northern Italian jewelry. According to art historians, Jael's tools might actually hint at the profession of the lady that is portrayed. Was she a goldsmith, like Meir da Sessa's wife? Even though I'm unsure about this interpretation, I wish to stress another detail that allows us to hold that the portrayed woman was Jewish. The lady dons a very peculiar hat, one that could only be found in German lands and in earlier periods. Is this a hint to a possible Ashkenazi origin of this young woman? The second portrait by Bartolomeo Veneto that interests us here is now in the Thyssen collection in Madrid. According to recent interpretation, this man may be identified with Abraham Farissol, even though no evidence supports such identification. However, this gentleman, who wears fashionable clothes and a beautiful hat, holds in his right hand a mysterious object. In the past, this was identified as a toothpick, but this would seem rather odd. If we focus on the object, we see that it is a very nicely executed piece of jewelry that has a small hand at its bottom. Was this a Torah pointer, a yad, a tool that would immediately identify the profession of the painted man? It is well known that Abraham Farissol was a renowned sofer, a scribe of Hebrew, biblical, and liturgical texts, and the Chazan, or cantor, that worked for the Farraran congregation. I think that the object could be actually a hatpin in the shape of a pointer. For a non-Jewish viewer, this appears as a sign of distinction. A wealthy man displays a precious jewel. For a Jewish viewer, this would be a clear hint at the communitarian belonging of the portrayed man. If this interpretation is correct, the man portrayed in the painting, even if not Abraham Farissol, was a Jewish signore, one of the wealthy patrons of the beautiful manuscripts that were executed in the Farraran environment. Jews in northern Italian cities were relatively well integrated in the local society. Farissol's life more or less overlaps that of another Farraran outstanding author of the generation, one of the most illustrious poets in the history of Italian literature, Ludovico Ariosto. In Ariosto's comedies, describing the Farraran society of his days, we find allusions to the local Jews. Although evidently written to entertain an aristocratic audience, Ariosto's comedies never employ vicious characterizations of their Jewish characters. Rather, all of them fit seamlessly into the composite society of the relatively tolerant Este court of the early 16th century. Ariosto's attitude towards Jews was nothing remarkable in contemporary Ferrara. He wrote his comedies for an audience who wanted a lively representation of daily life, not a theological debate. Indeed, Ariosto's writings never mention the complex intellectual discussions on both religious and scientific subjects that occurred when learned Christians encountered learned Jews in Renaissance Ferrara. I'm thinking, for instance, of the important theological disputation between Abraham Farissol and Pietro Palagiano from Trani. The debate took place at the court of Hercules I around 1487 and sparked even more polemic. At a later period, the converso physician Amatus Lusitanus, born in Portugal and the author of the medical bestseller Curationum Medicinalium Centurie Septem, 700 medicinal cures, tells us that several Jewish scholars would meet with converts and Christians in public and private spaces in Ferrara in order to discuss theological and philosophical issues. Although there has been no study of Ariosto's direct relations with Jewish contemporary intellectuals, recent scholarship has investigated Ariosto's role in the literary education of the Renaissance Jews, and not just in Italy. Versions of Ariosto's renowned poem Orlando Furioso were produced in Hebrew and in other languages spoken by European Jews, and some even written in Hebrew characters. At the end of the 16th century, one of the most important Italian rabbis of the early modern era, Leone da Modena, translated 2 cantos of the Orlando Furioso into Hebrew. In the previous generation, another Leone, the Mantuan Leone de Sommi Portaleone, based a play of his own on Ariosto's comedy Lena. Leone's comedy, written in Hebrew, is titled Tzachot Bedikuta de Kiddushin. The title is an Aramaic formula, a stylish farce on engagement or betrothal. This was the first comedy written in Hebrew that made use of classical patterns. It was recently translated into English as a comedy of betrothal. The direct influence of Ariosto's Furioso on Jewish Renaissance culture is evident. No less significant is its indirect effect on literary models widely known in 16th century Jewish society. Jews in northern Italy, especially Ashkenazi Jews, adapted the popular chivalric genre to biblical narrative. We still have lengthy poems on the books of Kings and also a poetic version of the books of Samuel dating to the end of the 15th century. In the manner of the psalmist drama, these epic poems merged motifs from non-Jewish sources with rabbinic texts, which made them more authoritative within the Jewish communities. Elijah Levita, best known for his intellectual collaboration with non-Jews, and especially the famous Cardinal Egidio Antonini da Viterbo, adapted 2 chivalric stories, Bovo d'Antona and Paris e Vienna, into Yiddish. The first, entitled Bovobuch, dates to the first decade of the 16th century, making it one of the oldest monuments of Yiddish literature. Each story is told in about 700 ottava rima stanzas, the first use of this format in Germanic literature. Paris und Wiener, composed around 1530, is based on an Italian version of a tale of chivalry from the 13th century. In this case, Levita sticks closer to Ariosto's model, injecting himself frequently into the narrative and confessing that he is a frustrated lover, hoping his beloved's heart will be more lenient with him after she hears the story of the 2 famous lovers. Levita feels free to speak satirically, mainly in the prologues of the 10 books of his poetic narrative. Against such a socio-cultural background, we better understand the opening words of Farissol's treatise Orhot Olam, where the author warns the reader against the meshalim, that is, fictional literature or belletristic, that he describes as mainly consisting of love songs or historical books of ancient wars. Farissol certainly had in mind the kind of literature that was widespread in both Jewish and non-Jewish northern Italian society in the 16th century, and which was accessible both in Italian and in Hebrew, and that the contemporary printing industry contributed to circulate. We have just taken a brief tour of Renaissance Ferrara, the word out of which Farissol emerged. I want to focus now on Farissol's work in the context of the Renaissance humanist fascination with nature. The famous Rothschild Miscellany of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem is the most elegantly and lavishly executed Hebrew manuscript of the Italian Renaissance. It was planned as a sumptuous work which would encompass in detail almost every custom of religious and secular Jewish life of the Italian region where its wealthy patron lived. Fanciful landscapes, special perspective settings, human and animal representations echo the style of the best artists who worked for the court of the Este in Ferrara in the third quarter of the 15th century. Indeed, the illuminations of this glorious masterworks may have been associated with the worship that decorated the famous Latin Bible of Borso d'Este. Among its contents is the Book of Job, which the Miscellany displays in its entirety. There, we find a full-page miniature that depicts the chief character's initial wealth. Workers within an idyllic rural setting are shown in Job's fertile fields, while in the foreground shepherds tend Job's flocks. In representing a typical northern Italian countryside, the illuminator also hints at the exotic location of Job's faraway and exotic land. In the lower left side of the scene, a dromedary appears alongside sheep, oxen, and donkeys, thus faithfully following the introductory section of the Book of Job. Indeed, this biblical book was credited by most Jewish interpreters of the Renaissance era as the fundamental source for all sorts of encyclopedic knowledge. The exotic stones, plants, animals mentioned in the book, as well as the mythical lands where they should be found, could be analyzed by modern interpreters in light of the new geographic and scientific discoveries of the period. One of the many Jewish interpreters of the Book of Job in the Italian Renaissance was Abraham Farissol. While in Florence, Farissol took part in the academic life and befriended both Jewish and non-Jewish scholars who lived there. He was welcomed by the Christian nobility and had the opportunity to meet Lorenzo de' Medici himself, whose tolerance toward any religion or confession was widely known. The same curiosity about nature that appears in the decoration of the Rothschilds' Miscellany emerged from a personal remark written in Farissol's Iggeret Orhot Olam. In this relatively short treatise on geography, possibly the earliest of this genre ever produced in Hebrew, we read in chapter 21 that camelopards live in the African region of Bondomo, that is located in the continent of Ethiopia, far from the ocean. And I have seen one of such animals in our days in Florence in the year 245, according to our minor computation. Camelopard was the name given in the 15th century to the animal that we currently call giraffe. In this passage, Farissol reports an event he personally attended, though not in 1485, as he purports. On November 18, 1487, a giraffe was sent to Florence as a present for Lorenzo de' Medici from the Sultan of Egypt. Lorenzo's giraffe aroused an incredible curiosity in his days and was portrayed in several paintings. The same fascination with nature and exotic worlds that triggered the exquisite illumination of the Rothschild's Job appears in a detail of Domenico Ghirlandaio's fresco painting in Santa Maria Novella, Florence, where the Medici's giraffe appears in the Magi's procession moving from the Far East to worship the newborn Jesus. For both Jews and Christians, seeing a live giraffe was tantamount to acknowledging the significance and unfathomable possibilities of God's creation, as demonstrated in the book of Job. In the last years of his life, when he composed his geographic treatise, a man of knowledge such as Farissol, who was immersed in the most vibrant intellectual society of his days, certainly realized that the world that surrounded him was changing dramatically. The circulation of new ideas was fueled by many different phenomena. Commerce and print were major contributors to this movement of ideas, as we see in the wide popularity of Medici's giraffe, which, though it died soon after its arrival, was widely discussed and depicted, making an enormous impact on contemporary and later European imagination about the newly discovered world. The printing industry allowed wider audiences to be informed about subjects that were not part of the traditional education, and this could also arouse not just curiosity, but also anxiety, all the more so within the Italian Jewish society. Since its inception, print was much cherished by Jewish scholars who cooperated with the most prestigious printers, be they Jewish or Christian. In Farissol's days, Venice was developing an impressive production of Hebrew printed books, and Farissol's commentary on the book of Job was printed in Venice by Daniel Bomberg in 1517 in the first Biblia Rabbinic edition. Farissol's commentary on Job is full of geographic and ethnographic descriptions. The author explains the location of the biblical land of Uz, describes the caravan routes and customs of the East, and indicates the 7 climatic zones. And even though at the beginning he holds that the lands below the equator are uninhabitable by man, he later adds that the southern hemisphere is indeed inhabitable and refers to the new geographic discoveries. Farissol's treatise is evidently grounded in a long-lasting interest of the author in geography. However, Farissol's first aim was that of drawing inspiration from the Bible, as it appears from the choice of the title. Indeed, Orhot Olam, the paths of the world, is a quotation from the book of Job, where the Hebrew phrase is endowed with a profoundly different meaning than what we would expect from Farissol's introductory words. In the standardized English version of the Bible, the verse reads, "Will you keep to the old path that the wicked have trod?" Farissol changes this plain meaning of the biblical text, giving it a new interpretation. The Orhot Olam of Job are certainly not the ways of the new world, the itineraries a modern traveler should follow, nor are they the paths of wickedness, as in Job, but are rather those of the valued tradition that should not be abandoned, even in new worlds. Farissol walks between the old paths of Jewish tradition and the new paths of the recently discovered lands and new knowledge. Despite the major changes produced by the recent geographic discoveries, men should keep faithful to the word of the Lord. Farissol's goal was to demonstrate that no matter what new discoveries were made by explorers and scientists, The Hebrew scripture was the true source of any possible knowledge and information. New discoveries do not change, but only corroborate what is in the Holy Book. It is in such vein that in the introduction to his Geographic Treatise, Farissol exclaims, "Try now to understand how much all the scholars," and here he evidently refers to non-Jewish scientific authorities, "all the scholars lack the divine law by noting the many places from which, when correctly interpreted, we may derive all possible information on the borders of hitherto unknown lands, on the people of those lands, and on the natural phenomena occurring in those same places, as it is evident from the book of Genesis, or information on the history of the generations of the people, and their borders, and their countries, as can be found in the book of Joshua. Certainly, the Word of God has not been written in vain, but to let us know what all the inhabited world looked like, as well as all the peculiarities of the wonders that God bestowed on His own creation." This is why modern readers should not be surprised when Farissol describes existing lands and people alongside, I quote, "the earthly Garden of Eden." Already in the previous generations, Italian Jews had taken advantage of the cultural developments that had reshaped their cultural surroundings so deeply. Judah Messer Leon, one of Farissol's teachers, had taught many Jewish students in his itinerant yeshiva about Aristotelian philosophy, rhetoric, and other topics that constituted the core of the Italian humanist curriculum. Messer Leon highlighted the significant role played by the natural sciences in Jewish education in his masterwork Sefer Nofet Tzufim, the book of the honeycomb's flow. He states there that after we have come to know all the sciences or some part of them, we study the words of the Torah. Then the eyes of our understanding open to the fact that the sciences are included in the Torah's words, and we wonder how we could have failed to realize this from the Torah itself to begin with. Judah's son, David, a very talented Aristotelian philosopher and an itinerant rabbi, asked one of his colleagues, Jacob ben David Provenzali, whether the traditional law would allow Jews the study of the natural sciences. Provenzali replied that the artes naturales, that is, scientific disciplines, were indeed to be praised. In other words, the intellectual receptivity of the Italian Jewish scholars was subject to the condition that new literary and scientific attitudes accord with biblical and post-biblical traditional Jewish lore. Just as Messer Leon had rediscovered classical rhetoric in the Hebrew scripture, so Farissol wanted to match the interest of his contemporaries in geographic discoveries with the Jewish traditional interpretation of the Bible. Farissol was a talented teacher of the scripture, inspired by the excellent education received in Judah Messer Leon's Mantuan yeshiva. While in Mantua, Farissol might have met for the first time Yohanan Alemanno, another erudite disciple of Messer Leon, and another Jewish scholar whose family had moved from France into Italy in the 1430s. Like Alemanno, Farissol wandered throughout northern Italy, moving between Mantua, Ferrara, and Florence. In Lorenzo de' Medici's capital, the two intellectuals joined the thriving society of what possibly was one of the most important cultural hubs of late 15th century Western Europe. While in Florence, Alemanno and Farissol met with the local scholars, both Jews and non-Jews. They were both seeking new scholarly categories with which to teach their students. About 20 years before Farissol composed his Geographic Treatise, Yohanan Alemanno described in his impressive Hebrew notebook some of the most important discoveries carried out recently by Portuguese and Spanish explorers. Alemanno did not make explicit mention of the American continent, although he wrote in a note, quote, "I have heard rumors about the discovery of new words," end of quote. Alemanno dated this remark to 1504, so he may well have had access to documents related to the most recent maritime expeditions of the Florentine Amerigo Vespucci, whose letter on Atlantic explorations sent to Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici appeared in print exactly in 1504. More than the New World itself, Alemanno's interest was directed to travel accounts carrying messianic significance. Most of the information provided by Alemanno in his notebook relates to the appearance of the lost Jewish tribes in India and Ethiopia and to the actual location of the kingdom of the mysterious Prester John, a Christian monarch said to be of Jewish origin. His rule was said to extend over a vast area located in India, although this geographic term actually defined the Indian subcontinent along with southern Arabia and Ethiopia. From those distant lands, a Messiah was soon to awaken the Jewish expectations in the West. That the same sorts of accounts were sought by Christian scholars comes as no surprise. For example, the geographic section of the enormous library owned by Cardinal Pietro Bembo comprised printed accounts of the recent missions led by the Portuguese to explore the lands of Prester John, who was then mostly identified with the Negus, or king of Ethiopia. Like their Christian counterparts, Jews could not help mixing reality and fiction, and we should not forget that the first edition of Prester John's letters was printed in Venice in 1478 in Italian, and the above-mentioned poet Ludovico Ariosto refers to the kingdom of Prester John in his Orlando Furioso. The same topics were tackled by Abraham Farissol, who deals passionately in his geographic treatise with the same information on Jews in India and Ethiopia, the descendants of the ancient lost tribes of Israel, as well as with Prester John. Moreover, Farissol devotes a whole chapter of his work to the description of the messianic adventure of David HaReubeni, the alleged son of a Jewish monarch from Arabia or Ethiopia who visited Italy in the early 1520s. The 14th chapter of Iggeret Orhot Olam opens with the explicit intervention of the author, who wants to witness his personal involvement in Reubeni's messianic mission. To add value to this treatise that I composed in order to reveal the paths of the world to the ignorant, I, Abraham Farissol, decided to write about the roots of the Jewish man from the lost tribes, whose name is David ben Solomon, that we saw in our country, Italy. Iggeret Orhot Olam is not atypical of the intellectual world of his time, deeply invested in new knowledge and yet filtering all of it through the lens of traditional knowledge, seeing new sciences contained in ancient texts and messianic fulfillment on exotic shores. Farissol represented the synthesis of so many intellectual worlds. However, since Alemanno's days, attitudes to travel had changed. Until the end of the 15th century, for most of the Europeans, travel mainly meant pilgrimage to holy places. After the discovery of new regions of the earth, what is generally defined as the pius viator or pious traveler model turned into the more modern model of the studiosus explorator, the scholarly explorer. European readers became increasingly concerned with accounts of pioneering explorers of the remotest regions of Africa and less interested in the best routes to reach Jerusalem. Evidence of such change appears in Farissol's book. This, despite his interest in traditional geographic literature on the lost tribes and Prester John's kingdom. Not surprisingly, this author uses often the Hebrew word hoker, scholar, scientist, as well as cosmographia from contemporary Latin or Italian, to describe his scientific attitude to the subject he's dealing with in his book. Like many of his predecessors working in Italy, Farissol meant to collect scientific data of his days and translate it into Hebrew in order to create a sort of compendium of material that was widely popular in other languages. Jews could read this literature in those languages, but Farissol wanted to establish a Jewish intellectual paradigm that asserted the Italian Jewish identitarian belonging to a Renaissance ambience. As the author maintains in the introduction, his book encompasses material drawn from personal readings and conversations with contemporary Jews and non-Jews, especially merchants that he had met in Ferrara. Besides stressing geography's biblical foundation, Farissol criticized the traditional geographic attitudes that were being abandoned in his days following the new discoveries. For Farissol, like for most, if not all of his colleagues, the cosmographus par excellence was Ptolemy, the 2nd century Roman geographer and polymath, and Farissol certainly had in mind the letters world maps that circulated in print in those days, and especially in Ferrara. In addition, he mentions 3 printed editions of a Mappa Mundi, a world map, from Venice, Florence, and Germany, Ashkenaz. He could have referred to the Ptolemy editions that appeared in Florence in 1482, in Venice in 1511, in Ulm in 1482 and 1488, or in Strasbourg in 1513. Another interesting source of information might have been a map such as that drawn by the Venetian cartographer Pietro Coppo, who in 1520 produced one of the first world maps in which a triangular shape appears beyond the Atlantic Ocean. Such a triangle corresponds to the Southern American lands discovered by Amerigo Vespucci and described by Farissol on the basis of contemporary geographical accounts, as we will see later on. For all those reasons, Farissol shows a critical attitude toward Ptolemy, whose mathematical geography had been revived by 15th century Italian humanists. For instance, in chapter 13 of the Iggeret, Farissol remarks that it is a real wonder that the new continent has been discovered, all the more so since the most illustrious scientist Ptolemy was totally unaware of its existence. As a matter of fact, he could not see it, and this is why he could not describe it. In this perspective, Farissol's attitude is rather philological and reveals his adaptation to some of the humanist trends of his days. The fascination with the opening of new travel routes was related also to the possibility of establishing new trading connections and making easier access to exotic products that until then had been almost unattainable. As most northern Italian cities derive their wealth from commerce, the opening of new routes that followed the Portuguese discoveries threatened competition. In 1507, Luca Gaurico, an eminent scientist at the Este court, composed an answer to a question passionately debated in Ferrara in those days as to whether the Earth was inhabited below the equator. After drawing upon Ptolemaic sources that asserted that men of the northern hemisphere had never penetrated beyond the equator, Gabrico noted that, I quote, "In our time, many Portuguese, Spaniards, and Italians have sailed there and brought back spices to us," end of quote. The major Italian trading companies sent emissaries to Portugal for updates on the most recent discoveries. Letters were exchanged on a daily basis between the Portuguese and their Italian patrons. In those activities, Jews were not passive observers. Being many of them involved in trade, they also embraced a passion for a geographical science no longer influenced by myth. A few chapters of Farissol's treatise aim to describe these new trading routes. Given all this rich and complex context, it is time to talk of the work itself. In most of the manuscripts, as well as in the printed editions, the book appears divided into 30 chapters. However, two manuscripts witness a fragment of the 31st chapter which was not completed. In the first part of the book, Farissol mainly deals with the Ptolemaic cosmographical theory on which he intends to found his work. Besides his enumeration of the three continents then known, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the boundaries of all the countries of the world, Farissol devotes 2 chapters to elucidating the 7 climatic zones and the method by which a specific location can be pinpointed on a map through the use of latitude and longitude. Since his explanations are ambiguous, it is possible that he was quoting a Ptolemaic source that he had available without questioning its precision. Again, a possible source could be one of the many Portolan maps or compass charts to which he would have added indications of longitude and latitude, as those in Pietro Coppo's atlas entitled De Toto Orbe, on the world, which was never published in print but circulated widely in manuscript copies. In the following chapters of his work, Farissol describes the boundaries of all the areas of the world then known. He first deals with North Africa and Christian Europe. He describes then the new navigation routes opened by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, especially around the African continent. He also highlights the importance of the new trading routes between Italy and Egypt and Italy and Flanders. A large section of Farissol's work is devoted to the various routes to reach the Eastern Mediterranean and the land of Israel. Mention is made of the main seaports along such routes. Chapter 10 entire describes the actual boundaries of the land of Israel. Most of the following chapters deal with the new lands discovered by the Portuguese. In chapter 13, biblical sources are provided for the new lands discovered in Africa by the Portuguese. Thus, for example, Farissol relates the Insule Fortunate, Lucky Islands, that are the Canary Islands, in the Atlantic Ocean to the biblical land of Ophir. This chapter is a sort of introduction to the second part of the book, where the author will continually remind the reader that all the newly discovered lands were already described in the Bible. In chapter 14, he deals with the Syro-Messiah David Harriobeni. Rumors about his allegedly messianic undertakings spread out in Italy in 1523, and in the following year David made it to Venice and then to Rome. Farissol is a faithful witness of Reubeni's adventure and remarks that he does not like those who falsify truth. He reports on Reubeni and his meeting with Pope Clement VII. He then adds that today, in the month of Marcheshvan 285, that is November 1524, he heard that Reubeni eventually managed to obtain the weapons he had requested from the Pope and to sail from Italy to Portugal. Farissol then argues that after meeting with the King of Portugal, Reubeni should better sail back to his country following the itinerary of the Portuguese sailors, that is, circumnavigating Africa. The following chapters, all through the 23rd, are ethnographic more than geographic. Farissol describes customs and places of the African continent. In particular, in chapter 16, he writes that the King of Portugal sent many people to an island that he called Porto Santo. According to Farissol, those were Anusim Jews who had been forced to convert at the end of the 15th century. Mention is then made of Cristofalo Colombo Genovese, that is, Christopher Columbus from Genoa. From chapter 24 on, Farissol deals with Asia. In chapter 24, Farissol explains that the Sabbatean River flows near the Ganges, next to Calicut. On this subject, he provides information drawn from the Talmud and Josephus. He purports that a great number of Jews dwell in the region of Gozan, beyond the Sabbatean River. This region and the other Jewish populated area in the African desert of Habor are kept separate by Muslim rulers that prevent the two Jewish settlements from reuniting and fighting against them. At the end of the chapter, mention is made yet again of David Harubeni. In the 25th chapter, Farissol explains that Prester John might live in the region of Calicut. On the basis of his source, a book entitled Mondo Novo, Farissol explains that in Rome there are currently 30 priests of Prester John, and that they have their own shrine in Rome. This is certainly a hint at the Christian Abyssinian community in Rome, which had been mentioned by Alemanno 20 years earlier. Farissol adds that he has heard similar stories also from an Arab trader in Ferrara. What is the relation between Calicut, or a strange place between India and Ethiopia, and the Abyssinians? In the late Middle Ages, the 10 lost tribes had been related to a Christian tradition based upon the imaginary existence of the legendary kingdom of Prester John. His rule was said to extend over a vast area located in India, although this geographic term actually defined the Indian subcontinent along with southern Arabia and Ethiopia. This vague identification was due to the widespread idea that the Indian Ocean was smaller than it actually is, thereby making it possible to consider all countries facing the ocean as virtually one only region. In one of the work's most significant chapters, the 29th, Farissol reports on Columbus' discovery of the New World in 1492. It is now an established fact that the Spanish ships which were sent on an expedition by the King of Spain almost gave up hope of ever returning, but divine providence had decreed for them a kinder fate than death amid sea. Those at the topmost mast discerned a strip of land when they had sailed along its shores and saw its exceedingly large size. They called it, because of its great length and breadth, the New World. The land is rich in natural resources. They have an abundance of fish, large forests teeming with large and small beasts of prey, and serpents as large as beams. The sand along the shores of the rivers contain pure gold, precious stones, and mother of pearl. In the final 30th chapter, Farissol enumerates the possible locations of the Garden of Eden and eventually establishes its actual location in the Moon's Mountains region in Central East Africa, that is, the mythical sources of the Nile. The New Worlds and biblical geography fit perfectly in Farissol's description. Despite the many themes and topics covered, the cosmological picture of the world in the Iggeret Orhot Olam is based essentially on that of Aristotle and Ptolemy. Farissol probably knew a similar picture contained in Maimonides' Sefer HaMadda, Book of Science. His references to the location of Ophir, the kingdom of Prester John, and Jerusalem as the center of the world parallel standard themes shared by patristic as well as Jewish geographers throughout the Middle Ages. Farissol often mentions an Italian book that is titled Mondo Novo or Mondo Nuovo, New World, as his primary source, which helps him mostly to describe the customs of Oriental and African people. Elsewhere, Farissol quotes the book in Latin, Novus Orbis. Now, the most popular 16th century work with this title was the Novus Orbis Regionum atque Insularum Veteribus Incognitarum, which could be translated the New World of Regions and Islands Unknown to the Old People, published in Basel in 1532 by Simon Grineus and Johannes Curtisch. Farissol's treatise, as we know, was written almost 10 years earlier. However, the Novus Orbis, which would become the real bestseller of travel information for all Renaissance readers, was derived, at least in its first part, from another bestseller that was titled Paesi novamente ritrovati e Novo Mondo da Alberico Vespuccio intitolato, Newly Discovered Countries and New World called after Alberico, that is Amerigo Vespucci. This work was an Italian anthology of travel accounts, first published in Vicenza in 1507 by an Italian professor of sciences who worked in the Venetian area, Fracanzo or Francesco Antonio da Montalboddo. It was the first ever written anthology of travel accounts of the recent discoveries of Portuguese and Spanish navigators, and until it was superseded by Ramusius' volume of voyages and Grineus' Novus Orbis, it was the most influential printed work to disseminate the news of the recent discoveries through Europe. It appeared in 6 Italian editions, 6 French editions throughout the 16th century, and was translated into Latin and German already in 1508. The structure of Montalbotto's book is very similar to that of Farissol's Orhot Olam. The Jewish author actually quotes the original Italian words of Montalbotto's treatise several times, especially in the second part of his work. Farissol had access to Montalbotto's printed work from a Venetian edition, as he himself claims in chapter 24. Farissol's treatise has the earliest known sketch of America in a Hebrew book. We can see the drawing in the Schoenberg manuscript on folio 32 verso. The drawing appears at the end of chapter 29 of the Iggeret, and the comparison with Montalbotto's treatise reveals that this was Farissol's primary source. In its turn, Montalbotto used Amerigo Vespucci's letter addressed to Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici and published in Augsburg in 1504. This is an interesting phenomenon, the use of printed material for the decoration of manuscripts. One would assume that it generally happened the other way around, that is, one might expect printers to draw upon manuscript stylistic patterns to design and illustrate their publications. However, especially in the 16th century, when handwriting maintained its popularity in parallel with print, the two arts were often influential on each other. Let us now take into account the drawing of the stars in the southern hemisphere as it appears in the Schoenberg manuscript. On folio 32 verso, the sketch illustrates the sky as it would have appeared to sailors navigating under the equator, proceeding towards the coast of Brazil. Next to the stars, we see a triangle that hints at the form of the part of Southern America that had been first described by Vespucci. The writing that accompanies the drawing, a sort of caption, according to paleographist Edna Engel, could have been added by Farissol himself. This certainly increases the historical value of the manuscript, as there would be a direct intervention of the author on it. The drawing of the stars in our manuscript corresponds to that appearing on page 100 of Montalbado's work. The star diagram in Montalbado's work, as said, was originally part of the letter sent by Amerigo Vespucci to Pier Lorenzo de' Medici. The same can be said about the triangular drawing of the new continent that seems to be derived from the following page of Montalbado's text. There, a description of the new land is provided in the shape of a triangle. The whole chapter is entitled in Italian Forma della quarta parte della terra ritrovata, a form of the fourth part of the discovered land, that corresponds exactly to the Hebrew words included in the triangular shape in the Schoenberg manuscript. Tzurat Rabia Yabeshet Olam Chadash. Our Philadelphia manuscript is an in-quarto-size codex that contains 36 paper folios. It is written in an elegant Hebrew-Italian semi-cursive writing that certainly can be dated to the first half of the 16th century. Unlike other copies of the Iggeret, this one lacks any mention of its scribe, nor do we know in which year and city it was transcribed. However, since Farissol composed his work in 1524, and most of its dated copies were produced in the subsequent years in 1525-26, we can maintain, by comparison of this with the other witnesses, that our manuscript too was executed around 1525. According to the final remark, it was composed under the supervision of Farissol himself, and he certainly was alive when the copying of the text was finished, as the formula next to his name, "May his rock watch and protect him," demonstrates. From all this, we may assume that our manuscript was transcribed between 1525 and 1528, the date of Farissol's death possibly, and that it was produced within the scribal academy run by Farissol, either in Ferrara or in Mantua. The first 34 folios of the Codex contain the Iggeret Orhot Olam, and the very two last folios contain, though in a different Italian hand, an interesting Hebrew-rhymed composition on the game of chess, the work of a medieval Spanish or Provençal author, Ibn Yahya bon Schneur. About this work, which in all of its witnesses is titled Mlitzatzaha al-Shok Hashak, a lovely poem on the game of chess, we know that it was popular in northern Italy, where many juridical shelot or quesita of the Renaissance period attest to the passion for this game among Italian Jews. It is generally assumed that this manuscript was transcribed by a Joseph Finzi de Lignago. The place name should be corrected in Legnago, a city in northern Italy, very close to Verona, and the name of the scribe should be read Joseph Finzi di Legnago. The reason for such an identification should be related to the existence of at least two more manuscripts that contain Farissol's Iggeret, that were copied by the same Joseph Finzi. The two manuscripts, both of them extremely significant for the transmission of the Orhot Olam text, are Manuscript Budapest, Hungarian Academy of Sciences, Kaufmann 333, and Manuscript Parma, Biblioteca Palatina, number 2392. The Budapest manuscript consists of 33 folios and was copied in Mantua on Rosh Chodesh Marcheshvan, that is the first day of the month of Marcheshvan, of the year 286, that is the end of 1525, by Joseph of Legnago. The Parma manuscript is a miscellany that mainly consists of scientific treatises in Hebrew. According to its colophon, the scribe Joseph Finzi di Legnago completed its transcription on the 6th of the month of Adar of the year 286, again 1526. After the actual colophon, the scribe added a long formula which also appears in the Oxford manuscript, which we'll be dealing with later on. However, the Italian semi-cursive Hebrew writing of the Budapest manuscript is totally different than that of the Parma witness. The comparison of the writing of the Schoenberg Codex with these two witnesses shows a more distinct analogy with the Budapest manuscript. It is then possible to maintain that the Philadelphia manuscript was actually copied by Finzi approximately around 1525-26. Besides the three mentioned manuscripts, there are at least 4 more witnesses of the Orhot Olam. This should be taken into account. The manuscript Florence, Medicea Laurentiana Library, Pluteo 247, whose 33 folios contain only Farissol's work, the manuscript Oxford Bodleian Library, Oriental 104, the manuscript Vienna Austrian National Library, Hebrew 128, and the manuscript Paris Bibliothèque Nationale, Hebrew 897. The Florence manuscript has been credited for having been written by Farissol himself in a beautiful Northern Italian Hebrew semi-cursive script. It could thus be a very old witness that has a peculiarity. In it, Orhot Olam contains 31 chapters, unlike our copy and most of those mentioned earlier that only have 30 chapters. However, in the introductory table of contents, the Florence manuscript numbers only 30 chapters, and the Paris manuscript, however, that contains works of different subjects, hands, and periods, our treatise was copied in a Sephardi semi-cursive script. It also presents 31 chapters, but the table of contents has been updated and also numbers them all. The copyist must have had in front of him an original in which the last chapter, just as in the Florence manuscript, terminated abruptly. The Oxford manuscript has 30 chapters in an Italian semi-cursive Hebrew script. This was the codex after which Thomas Hyde translated Farissol's treatise into Latin and published it in Oxford in 1691, with the Hebrew original facing Hyde's very good Latin version. I wish to highlight that the same brilliant British Orientalist Thomas Hyde published in Oxford in 1694 the treatise on chess contained in the Schoenberg manuscript from another Bodleian manuscript. The printed Hebrew text on chess was also accompanied by Hyde's Latin version. The Vienna manuscript is the only one of these 4 that provides us with a date and the name of the copyist. This miscellaneous witness contains a copy of Farissol's treatise in Italian semi-cursive Hebrew script. According to the colophon, it was completed on the evening of Pesach, Passover, of the year 299, that is in 1540, by Joseph of Revere. The same colophon states that at the time of the composition of this manuscript, the author was no longer alive. Since the three other codices are not dated, it's hard to establish when exactly they were copied, even though their different writings can be traced back to the 16th century. A short excerpt of Farissol's treatise is extant also in the miscellaneous manuscript New York Jewish Theological Seminary 2063, written in an Italian hand that can be dated to the second half of the 16th century or later. There are three more copies of our treatise extant in 18th century manuscripts, a partial one in Cincinnati and two in Moscow. The Schoenberg manuscript is thus the only complete manuscript copy of the Iggeret Orhot Olam that is preserved today in an American collection. For its supreme value in the history of Jewish science and for being the first work that deals with the discovery of American Hebrew, this manuscript is of the highest importance. Moreover, its acquisition in the collections of the University of Pennsylvania highlights, along with other significant codices, the close links between the Italian Renaissance, European Judaism, and America.